think you can expand a bit on the Thomas text again, because that seems really interesting. And the second one was, why as a community do we always gravitate towards the violence and try to push people out of it?
Okay, so the first part, you want to know more about Thomas. I don't know, I think I just want you to Google that. If you don't know about the Gospel of Thomas. I mean, what I should say is that that was sort of an interesting piece for me, is how closely aligned the Gospel of Thomas on this particular parable. It like basically mirrors, and then obviously Jesus makes this really strange pronouncement. It's those merchants, we got to get them out of here. Which is an example of, it's curious how Jesus will say what we want him to say about our enemies at times, which is maybe some of how I would sort of lean towards the answer to your second question. And this is why I think questions like this and why the language of disruption is so helpful for me, because I think Jesus doesn't ever want to be caught using words that we would then turn at our enemies. He's always trying to correct, I think, that impulse. And if nothing else, he was trying to sort of shape a community that was actively embodying a response to that impulse that was all around them. And we know that early Christians did this. They did so with some, it was unheard of, is probably the best way to talk about it. And I think that's a sort of a compelling example. I find it one to sort of try to model.
On the Gospel of Thomas, if you aren't familiar with it, you should look it up. Just a bit of context here. We call it a gospel. It's not really a gospel like the four in our Bible. It's more of a collection of sayings. So it's just a list of sayings of Jesus. We do think it's pretty early, though, from possibly late in the first century. So these are early recordings of Jesus' sayings. Now, some fair warning here. If you look it up, there's a few weird ones in there. So there's a reason that the church didn't include this in our canon. But what it gives us is another early comparative literature to look at when we're looking at the sayings of Jesus in the gospel. So some really interesting stuff. I've talked about it a few times before. Check it out. On the violence question, I think the real thing here is that violence draws us in a way that very few narrative techniques do. Because I think we recognize violence in our world, and we have a fear of violence being perpetrated against us. And so when we hear these stories that are outsized and hyperbolic, we lean into it. We're like, well, what's going on there? I want to hear about this. So I do think it's not meant to say God is violent, Jesus is violent, this is this. I think it's about, hey, you're human beings, and I want your attention, and I want you drawn into this story. And when he tells these stories in this way, so hyperbolic, so exaggerated, that's our cue to say, okay, well, what's underneath that? So for reference, I just watched Alien Romulus last night. It's really good if you're into the Alien movies. I don't come out of a movie like that saying, hey, what do I reflect on in my life about how aliens are going to attack me? I reflect on the way the characters interacted with each other, the way they acted when they were scared, the way that they pulled together in different moments. The violence draws me into that story. I'll admit, I liked it. But what I reflect on in terms of who I am and how that changes my life is not, well, where do I see that violence and how do I imitate it? It's what did that violence move forward in the narrative that's going to help me? And that's what I think I want to look for here. Mm-hmm. Last thing I'll say, there's two different types of violence in this story, right? Mm-hmm. There's the guests that get killed. Then there's the guest who's not prepared. He's not dressed right. And it says, just throw him out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's a phrase we probably have all heard. Immediately we're thinking hell, probably. Well, what if that's just getting thrown out of a good party? And you're sad about that, and you're upset about that, and you're like, I want to be in there. Why can't you, Like, I don't think necessarily we should jump to some of the conclusions in our mind. What if it's just that? And what if, in the story, the question is, friend, why don't you look like you're ready for a party? And the guest is just looking for an answer. Because I was on the street and you dragged me in here. That's a good answer. Because what it does is it says, I know that I don't deserve to be here, but I've been invited by your grace and I'm grateful to be here. When he refuses to answer, it's like, you don't get why I brought you in here. You don't get what this is about. You don't get this party. You don't understand it. Maybe this isn't the party for you. And at that moment, the guy's like, oh, I blew it. And there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That doesn't mean an end. That doesn't mean he's never invited back. That doesn't mean there's no conversation beyond that. But it means in that moment, he didn't understand the beauty of the gift to be able to say, you know what? Because I haven't had a good suit in a really long time, and I got nothing, but I'm grateful to be here. I think that's an answer the host would have been like, I love it, man. Enjoy your drink. We'll talk to you later. I don't know. One more, maybe?
I'll just follow up. I actually had a piece early on. There are a number of parables. One of them that Jesus tells in Luke 15, where the father goes out to the son who's outside the party, which some commentators see as like, remember that we're telling a story about a God who's willing to go outside of a party that somebody has chosen to be outside of and bring them in. Remember that that's a narrative device that's there, and it's part of, I think, our reflection on God's character.
To get tossed out of the party a couple times and invited back later. I don't know.
That's an important piece, actually. Yeah, go ahead.
Text. So can you expand on chosen, few are chosen?
There are a whole bunch of people who would interpret it. And that's why I tried to sort of say, like, there is a way to interpret this text. In fact, most Christians will interpret it. It's just strictly about who's in and who's out. And I mean, this is why I spent a lot of time, probably a third of the time that I was sort of encouraging you to think with me about how to be imaginative participants and receivers of this text. I think if you reduce Jesus to saying, you know what, only a few people get chosen to hang out in the party, that is the antithesis of the story he just told. And I think that means we have some work to do in terms of, well, what does that mean? So I have a tendency to say, there was a line that I used the word chosen. I think I sort of played with this idea. It's like, well, what if we're the ones that are choosing? God's choice has already been made clear in this bountiful invitation we receive. And what if there are a few people who don't always choose chosenness? I think that's how I interact with Christ's, like that one line. I mean, I'm not even touching sort of the criticism of that. There's some people who like, what is this proverbial saying that Jesus is just tacking on at the end? I don't know if you have some awareness of that.
Chosen, predestination, elect language in the New Testament is very difficult for us in Western modern culture to get our heads around. Because immediately when we hear that, we think of individuals. Some individuals are chosen, some individuals are not chosen. That's not necessarily the way that Semitic communities, Jewish communities in the first century would have heard those words, right? Because we have chosen people, the chosen people of Israel. Does that mean everyone within Israel was on side with God? Clearly not. We've all seen the Old Testament. Chosenness meant being part of an invitation that was extended to a large group of people. So chosenness is not you are, you aren't. It's this is being extended to everyone. And in this parable, the chosen are the first group who reject the invitation. They're chosen. Then there's a second round of chosenness. Then there's a third round, which is the people who come and don't receive that chosenness. So at every layer, chosen has these different sort of meanings to it. We're all chosen because we're all invited by God. We're all chosen because we came here tonight. We're all chosen because we may receive, a word from God and connection with the Spirit of God in this message tonight, or we might reject that. But for us to filter it down to just some people are in, some people are out, is not a way that more communal communities like the first century would have heard words like that, because they would have been filtering it through that language of the chosen people of God, and within chosen people they would know some would reject that, some would lean into that. And so we have to kind of pull back the categories a little bit. I think that's one way that's helpful for us to think about it.